Marcus Johnson had just finished mowing the front lawn of his own home when 3 police cars came screaming down the quiet street. A neighbor had called in a report of a suspicious man breaking into a mansion that did not belong to him. Nobody on that street believed that the tall black man standing there in grass-stained work clothes could possibly be the owner of the largest house on the block. Marcus set down his rake, wiped the sweat from his brow, and calmly reached for the keys in his pocket to prove who he was. Even as he produced his identification and the deed to the property, the officers moved forward and forced his hands behind his back, snapping cold metal cuffs around his wrists on the very steps of his own porch. For a moment, it seemed the humiliation would simply end there. Another quiet injustice swallowed by an ordinary afternoon. Then a black military vehicle turned onto the street and rolled to a stop in front of the house, and the man who stepped out of it was not a lawyer or a bail bondsman, but a 4-star general who had come looking for Marcus himself. 6 months earlier, nobody on Maple Ridge Lane knew much about the quiet man who lived at number 14. Marcus had moved into the neighborhood a little over 2 years before, purchasing the large brick colonial with the wraparound porch using savings he had built over more than 25 years of military service. He kept to himself, waking before dawn out of habit, tending his garden with the same discipline he had once used to keep a forward operating base running on schedule. He fixed his own gutters, repaired his own fence, and mowed his own lawn every single Saturday, refusing the landscaping services that most of his wealthier neighbors used without a second thought. When an elderly widow 2 doors down needed her driveway shoveled after a snowstorm, Marcus was there before sunrise with a shovel and a thermos of coffee, never mentioning it again afterward. He was polite when spoken to, but he rarely volunteered information about himself, and something about his reserve made people curious in a way that was not always kind. Marcus never spoke about his military career unless directly asked, and even then his answers were brief and modest, giving away almost nothing of what he had actually done. Most of his neighbors simply assumed he worked some ordinary job downtown, perhaps in logistics or maintenance, since he was always dressed in plain clothes and drove an unremarkable gray pickup truck. None of them knew that inside his home, in a small study he rarely showed to visitors, hung photographs of men in uniform, standing in deserts and mountains, alongside medals that told a story none of them would have guessed. In his garage, folded neatly and displayed with quiet pride, was an American flag that had once flown over a base where he had commanded soldiers through some of the most dangerous years of his life. He kept it there, out of the front yard, not from shame, but from a lifelong instinct toward humility, a soldier's understanding that true honor rarely needs to be announced. To Marcus, dignity was not something you displayed for others to see. It was something you carried quietly, the way he had always carried his duty. Marcus had grown up in a small town in Ohio, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a diner, and a father who had himself served 2 decades in uniform before an injury forced him into early retirement. From an early age, Marcus understood that respect was something earned through action rather than words, a lesson his father repeated so often it eventually became less a piece of advice and more a part of who Marcus simply was. He enlisted the summer after finishing high school, choosing discipline and purpose over the uncertainty of a future he could not yet picture for himself. Over the following decades, he rose steadily through the ranks, not through ambition for its own sake, but because the men and women around him kept placing their trust in his judgment during moments when judgment mattered most. He served in postings that took him far from home for months and sometimes years at a time, missing birthdays, holidays, and the quiet, ordinary milestones that other families took for granted. By the time he finally hung up his uniform for good, Marcus had given more of his life to service than most people ever gave to anything at all, and he carried that history into retirement, the same way he carried everything else, quietly and without complaint. Not everyone on the street returned his quiet courtesy with the same respect. A retired accountant across the road often watched Marcus work in his yard with a suspicious squint, muttering to his wife that something about the man seemed off, though he could never quite explain what he meant. A young couple who had moved in the previous spring crossed the street whenever they saw him approaching, offering only stiff nods instead of the friendly hellos they gave to other neighbors. Marcus noticed these things, of course. A man who had spent decades reading the mood of a room did not miss suspicion when it was aimed at him. He remembered similar glances from long before his military career, moments scattered across his childhood and early adulthood when strangers had decided who he was before he ever spoke a single word. Those experiences had taught him early that reacting with anger rarely changed anything, and that the people most convinced of their own judgment were usually the hardest to persuade otherwise, through argument alone. Instead, he had built a kind of quiet armor over the years, a steadiness that let insults and suspicion pass by without leaving visible marks. Even when they left marks, he never showed anyone. It was not indifference, it was survival refined over decades into something close to grace. He had hoped, moving into a neighborhood like Maple Ridge Lane, that perhaps this chapter of his life might be different, that a man in his 50s with a well-kept home and a peaceful routine might finally be judged simply for what he did rather than how he looked doing it. He said nothing about it, choosing instead to keep mowing his lawn, keep repairing his fence, and keep waving politely at those who would not wave back. It was a small, private test of patience that Marcus had faced many times before in many different forms, and he had long ago decided that dignity meant refusing to let other people's fear change who he was. Still, an undercurrent of unease had been building on Maple Ridge Lane for months, waiting only for the right spark. That spark arrived on a bright Saturday morning when Diane Carver, who had moved into the house next door only 3 weeks earlier, watched Marcus through her kitchen window as he worked in his front yard. She had never spoken to him beyond a brief introduction at her housewarming, where he had politely declined her invitation to stay for cake, and in the weeks since she had built an entire story in her mind about who he might be. She saw a large man in worn clothing moving confidently around a house she assumed was far too grand for someone like him. And rather than asking a simple question, she reached for her phone and dialed the police. She described what she saw as a suspicious individual who appeared to be attempting to break into a home, careful to mention every detail that painted Marcus as a stranger rather than a resident. Diane hung up the phone, feeling as though she had done her civic duty, never once considering that she might be setting off a chain of events that would humiliate an innocent man in front of his own house. Within minutes, the first patrol car was already turning onto Maple Ridge Lane. Officer Ray Dobbins arrived first, followed closely by 2 more cruisers, their lights flashing against the quiet suburban houses as neighbors began stepping onto their porches to watch. Dobbins approached Marcus with his hand resting near his belt, ordering him to raise his hands where they could be seen, and Marcus complied instantly, setting down his rake and lifting his palms into the open air without hesitation. He spoke in a calm, even voice, the same tone he had once used to steady young soldiers under fire, and told the officers plainly that this was his home, and he had lived there for more than 2 years. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, unconvinced by a claim that did not match the picture forming in their minds, one shaped as much by the neighbor's fearful phone call as by anything Marcus had actually done. One of them asked why a homeowner would be dressed the way Marcus was dressed, wearing an old faded t-shirt and grass-stained work boots instead of anything that looked in their eyes like it belonged to a man of means. Marcus offered a small, patient smile and explained simply that he had been out cutting his own grass the way he did every single Saturday morning of the year. The younger officer at the scene, a rookie named Elena Cruz, who had only been on the force for 8 months, studied Marcus carefully and noticed something the others seemed to be ignoring. She saw the calm, practiced way he held himself, the discipline in his posture, and the total absence of panic or defensiveness in his voice, qualities she associated more with training than with guilt. She suggested quietly to her sergeant that they slow down and verify his story before doing anything further. But her sergeant waved off the concern, telling her that people who broke into homes always had smooth explanations ready. Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, careful to move in a way that would not alarm anyone, and produced a set of keys along with his wallet, containing his driver's license and the deed to the property. He held them out for inspection, his hands steady, his expression unreadable, the same expression he had worn through briefings far more dangerous than this one. The sergeant barely glanced at the documents before waving them aside, more interested in the crowd gathering across the street than in the proof standing directly in front of him. Marcus pressed the small remote, clipped to his belt loop, and the garage door beside them rose smoothly, revealing a neatly organized space filled with tools, a workbench, and the very flag he kept folded in privacy. Rather than accepting this as clear evidence, one of the officers suggested aloud that the remote could have been stolen, along with the keys, a theory that made little logical sense, but seemed to satisfy the growing suspicion in the air. Diane Carver, standing on her own porch with her arms crossed, called out that she was certain this man could not possibly be the owner of such a large and well-kept house. Her voice carried the confident certainty of someone who believed her instincts were a kind of evidence, and several other neighbors nodded along, their whispered agreement rippling down the sidewalk. Marcus stood quietly through all of it, watching the scene unfold with the detached patience of a man who had faced far worse than public suspicion, and had learned long ago which battles were worth fighting in the moment. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, did not do anything that might be twisted into justification for what came next. The sergeant finally decided he had heard enough, and with a short nod to his officers, ordered Marcus to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Cold metal closed around his wrists with a sharp metallic click that seemed to echo down the quiet street, and for the first time that morning, something flickered briefly across Marcus's face before settling back into stillness. He did not resist, did not pull away, did not give them a single reason to escalate further, because he understood with painful clarity that resistance would only make things worse for a man who looked like him. As the cuffs tightened, more neighbors stepped outside their homes to watch, phones rising into the air to capture the sight of a large black man restrained on the steps of his own front porch. Marcus lowered his eyes for just a moment, not in shame, but in the quiet effort of controlling emotions that had every right to surface, and then lifted his gaze again, steady and composed. The morning that had begun with the simple, ordinary task of mowing his lawn had turned, in the span of only a few minutes, into something that would test every ounce of discipline he had built over a lifetime. Marcus was guided down onto the top step of his own porch, the cuffs biting into his wrists as he sat beneath the gaze of neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk like spectators at some strange public trial. Phones continued to rise and record, some held by curious teenagers who had wandered over from nearby houses, capturing footage that would later circulate with captions no one would be proud of. A man from across the street called out something mocking about people who pretended to own things that were not theirs, and a ripple of uncomfortable laughter passed through part of the crowd. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his spine straight even while seated, refusing to let the cuffs or the whispers bend the posture he had carried through decades of far greater trials. He had learned long ago that dignity was not a performance for an audience. It was a discipline maintained even when no one believed you deserved it. Still, the weight of dozens of judgmental stares pressed down on him in a way that no physical burden ever had. One of the officers, perhaps trying to make conversation, or perhaps testing him further, asked Marcus what he did for a living, and Marcus answered simply that he was retired. The officer asked where he had worked before retiring, and Marcus replied without embellishment that he had spent his career in the military. A short, disbelieving laugh came from one of the other officers standing nearby, who remarked that everyone claimed to have served when it was convenient for their story. Marcus did not correct him, did not raise his voice, did not offer proof beyond what he had already provided, because he understood that some people's minds were closed long before any evidence could reach them. He simply sat there, cuffed and silent, absorbing an insult that struck far deeper than any of them realized, given the decades of genuine sacrifice behind the plain word he had spoken. The crowd's murmurs continued, filled with speculation about who this stranger might really be and what crime he might have actually committed. Diane Carver stood near the front of the small gathering, watching the scene with an expression that had begun to shift from certainty towards something closer to doubt, though she was not yet ready to admit it even to herself. She had made the call in good faith, or so she told herself. Yet something about the calm dignity of the man being held on his own porch steps did not match the panic she had described on the phone. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself that the police would sort out the truth, that this was simply the system working as it was supposed to work. Around her, other neighbors traded theories in hushed voices, some suggesting Marcus might be a repairman who had gone too far, others insisting he must be some kind of con artist casing houses in the area. None of them considered even briefly that the simplest explanation might also be the true one, that a quiet man who kept to himself was exactly who he claimed to be. The morning sun climbed higher overhead, indifferent to the injustice unfolding in its light. It was in the middle of this tense, uncertain silence that the low rumble of a heavier engine reached the street, distinct from the idling patrol cars already parked along the curb. Heads began to turn as a dark, unmarked military SUV rounded the corner of Maple Ridge Lane, moving with a kind of unhurried authority that immediately felt out of place among the ordinary suburban houses. The vehicle slowed as it approached the gathered crowd, its tinted windows giving no hint of who might be inside, and several of the officers on scene exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus, still seated on the step with his wrists bound behind him, lifted his head slightly at the sound, a flicker of quiet recognition passing behind his otherwise unreadable eyes. The murmuring crowd grew quieter as the SUV came to a full stop directly in front of the house, its engine idling like the pause before an unexpected turn in a story no one had expected to witness. Nobody on that street yet understood how much the next few minutes were about to change. The rear door of the SUV opened, and a broad-shouldered man in a colonel's uniform stepped out onto the pavement, his posture immediately commanding attention in a way that made even the police officers straighten instinctively. His eyes moved quickly across the scene, taking in the patrol cars, the gathered crowd, and finally landing on Marcus, seated in handcuffs on his own porch steps. Whatever composure the colonel had carried while stepping out of the vehicle vanished the moment recognition crossed his face, replaced by something closer to shock and barely restrained anger. He strode forward without hesitation, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd as he demanded to know who had given the order to restrain this particular man. The officers stammered, glancing at one another, none of them eager to claim responsibility for a decision that suddenly seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. Diane Carver felt something cold settle in her stomach as she watched the colonel's reaction, a growing sense that she had badly misjudged the situation she had set into motion. Before anyone could offer a proper answer to the colonel's question, the low hum of a second engine rolled down the street, and every head turned once more toward the sound. This time it was a long black limousine bearing military markings, moving with slow, deliberate weight, the kind of vehicle that did not belong on an ordinary residential street on an ordinary Saturday morning. It came to a stop directly behind the SUV, its presence alone enough to silence even the last scattered whispers among the crowd. The colonel turned toward it immediately, his posture snapping into something even more rigid than before, and the officers, who had been so certain of themselves only minutes earlier, now shifted uneasily on their feet. Marcus remained seated on the step, watching the limousine with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, though something in his eyes suggested he understood exactly what was about to happen. The entire street seemed to hold its breath as the limousine's rear door began to open. A tall man stepped out of the limousine, his uniform bearing 4 silver stars that caught the morning light, and the effect on everyone present was immediate and total. Every officer on the scene straightened instinctively, years of training overriding whatever confidence had carried them through the morning's earlier decisions. The colonel snapped to attention so fast it startled several of the watching neighbors, his hand rising in a crisp salute that left no doubt about the importance of the man now walking toward them. The general did not acknowledge the officers, did not glance at the gathered crowd, did not pause to survey the scene the way most visitors might have. His eyes were fixed entirely on Marcus, seated in handcuffs on the steps of his own home, and he crossed the lawn with long, purposeful strides that carried unmistakable urgency. Nobody on that street had ever seen anything like it, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything the morning had produced so far. Sergeant Whitaker, who had ordered the handcuffs placed on Marcus only an hour earlier, felt his stomach twist as he watched the general's long, deliberate strides cross the lawn. He had spent 15 years on the force, confident in his ability to read a situation quickly, and that confidence had led him to dismiss every piece of evidence Marcus had calmly presented. Now, watching a man of such obvious rank move with such urgency toward the very person he had cuffed, Whitaker began to understand with sickening clarity just how badly he had misjudged the morning. He glanced at Officer Cruz, the rookie who had raised doubts earlier and been overruled, and found he could not meet her eyes. The other officers on scene shifted uncomfortably, their earlier certainty draining away with every step the general took, replaced by a dawning awareness that words alone would not undo what had already happened. For the first time since the patrol cars had arrived, the street was completely, utterly silent. The general knelt down in front of Marcus, bringing himself to eye level with the seated man, and his voice, when it came, was low and filled with something that sounded almost like grief. He apologized for making Marcus wait, his tone carrying none of the distance or formality one might expect from a man of such rank speaking to someone he had only just approached. Marcus simply nodded once, his expression softening only slightly, the way old friends acknowledge each other without needing many words to bridge the years between them. The general turned his head sharply toward the nearest officer and ordered the handcuffs removed immediately, his voice carrying an authority that required no further explanation or debate. Hands fumbled with the key, the metal cuffs falling away from Marcus's wrists with a small metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence of the street. The entire atmosphere on Maple Ridge Lane shifted in that instant from suspicion and judgment to something closer to disbelief and quiet shame. As Marcus rubbed his freed wrists, the general remained kneeling beside him, seemingly unconcerned with the growing crowd of neighbors now watching in open astonishment. He began speaking, not just to Marcus, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, explaining in a voice thick with respect exactly who the man seated before them truly was. He described how Marcus had once commanded some of the most dangerous special operations of his career, missions that had saved the lives of hundreds of soldiers who might otherwise never have come home. He spoke of how Marcus had turned down multiple offers of promotion over the years, choosing again and again to remain with his unit rather than accept a safer position further from the front lines. He mentioned the medals Marcus had earned, decorations that few soldiers ever received in a lifetime, awarded for acts of courage that Marcus himself had never once spoken about to anyone on this street. The crowd, which only minutes earlier had been mocking and doubting him, now stood in stunned, humbled silence as the truth unfolded before them. The general continued, his voice growing quieter but no less firm, explaining that after retiring from active duty, Marcus had refused nearly every honor and privilege offered to him, choosing instead to live simply and quietly, away from any spotlight. He had never appeared in interviews, never allowed his story to be told publicly, never sought the kind of recognition that so many others might have welcomed after a career filled with sacrifice. The general admitted, with a faint and weary smile, that he himself had once served directly under Marcus many years earlier, back when he was a much younger officer, still learning what real leadership looked like. It was Marcus, he said, who had taught him that true command was measured not in medals or rank, but in the willingness to carry burdens quietly so that others did not have to. Diane Carver, standing near the edge of the crowd, felt her earlier certainty crumble entirely, replaced by a hot, uncomfortable wave of shame that rose all the way to her cheeks. Around her, the officers who had cuffed Marcus less than an hour earlier now stood frozen, beginning to grasp the full weight of the mistake they had made. The general went on to describe a mission from many years earlier, one he said he still thought about often, when a convoy under his command had been ambushed in rugged terrain far from any hope of quick rescue. It was Marcus, then leading a small special operations unit, who had guided the wounded and the frightened through hours of chaos, refusing to leave until every last soldier had been accounted for and brought to safety. 3 men owed their lives directly to decisions Marcus made that night, decisions that could easily have cost him his own life instead. The general's voice caught slightly as he spoke of it, the memory clearly still vivid despite the years that had passed since it happened. He said that he had carried the lesson of that night with him through every promotion that followed, understanding that real leadership meant staying when staying was hardest, not simply giving orders from somewhere safe. Listening to the story, several of the officers who had been so quick to doubt Marcus now found themselves unable to look away, humbled by a version of the man they thought they already understood. In the hours that followed, the local police department launched an internal review of everything that had happened that morning, starting with the footage captured by security cameras mounted along the street. Diane Carver's own neighbor, 2 houses down, had a camera angled toward the road, and its recording showed Marcus driving into his own driveway at 7 in the morning, exactly as he did every single day. Property records were pulled and confirmed within minutes that Marcus Johnson had owned the house at number 14 Maple Ridge Lane for more than 2 years, with no irregularities of any kind attached to the deed. Investigators noted that the original call reporting a suspicious break-in had been based entirely on assumption, with no actual evidence of wrongdoing ever offered by the caller. Several officers admitted, when questioned individually, that they had dismissed Marcus's calm explanations and physical proof almost immediately, influenced more by his appearance than by anything he had actually said or shown them. The department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal case, and for the first time that day, questions began shifting away from Marcus and toward the decisions that had led to his humiliation. Diane Carver found herself unable to shake the memory of Marcus's calm, steady face as he sat cuffed on his own porch, a memory that grew heavier with every hour that passed. She had believed in the moment that she was protecting her new neighborhood, yet she now understood that her fear had been built on nothing more than the color of a man's skin and the clothes he happened to be wearing. Word of what had happened spread quickly along Maple Ridge Lane, carried from porch to porch by neighbors who had witnessed the scene themselves or heard about it from those who had. Some expressed genuine regret, admitting quietly to one another that they too had assumed the worst, without ever bothering to ask a single question. Others remained defensive, insisting that anyone would have done the same thing given the circumstances, though their voices carried less conviction than they had that morning. Beneath all the shifting reactions, one truth remained unchanged. A man who had spent his entire career protecting others had been treated as a threat by the very community he had quietly chosen to call home. News of the incident reached local reporters within a day, and by the following morning, the story of a decorated veteran handcuffed outside his own house had spread well beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. The police chief personally traveled to Maple Ridge Lane to speak with Marcus, arriving without cameras or fanfare, choosing instead a quiet, private conversation on the same porch where the humiliation had taken place. He offered a formal apology on behalf of the department, acknowledging that the officers involved had failed to follow proper procedure and had allowed assumption to override basic investigation. Marcus listened patiently, his expression calm as always, and thanked the chief for coming in person rather than sending a written statement through some distant office. The military, for its part, released a brief but firm confirmation of Marcus's service record, verifying every detail the general had spoken aloud on the lawn that morning. Across the neighborhood, several residents who had recorded mocking videos during the incident quietly deleted the footage from their phones, unable to look at it any longer without feeling the sharp sting of their own judgment. In the days that followed, a handful of veterans from the surrounding area began arriving at Marcus's door, some driving hours, simply to shake his hand and thank him for a service they had only just learned the full extent of. Marcus welcomed each of them with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, offering coffee and conversation rather than any grand statements about what he had endured. He refused every opportunity to criticize the officers involved by name, declining interview requests from reporters eager to turn his story into a spectacle of outrage. When one journalist pressed him for a strong statement condemning the police department, Marcus simply replied that honor did not require applause and that he had never done what he did in life for recognition. His restraint surprised many who expected anger. Yet those who knew him, even briefly, understood that this composure was simply who Marcus had always been. It was not the absence of pain, but the presence of a discipline built over decades of choosing dignity over vengeance. Among the veterans who came to visit was a man named Walter Higgins, gray-haired and walking with a slight limp, who had served under Marcus decades earlier during the same mission the general had described at the community meeting. Walter stood on the porch for a long moment before he could speak, finally telling Marcus in a voice thick with emotion that he had a daughter now, grown and married with children of her own, none of whom would exist if Marcus had not carried him out of that ravine so many years before. Marcus invited him inside, and the two men sat for hours over coffee, trading quiet memories that neither had spoken aloud in years, memories that belonged only to the small circle of people who had lived through them together. Walter admitted that he had followed news of the story online, and that seeing his old commander humiliated on his own porch had filled him with a rage he had not expected to feel so many years after retiring himself. Marcus listened patiently, and when Walter finished, he simply said that anger was a fair response, but that he had learned long ago it was rarely the response that changed anything for the better. Walter left that evening with a promise to return, and he did, becoming one of several old friends who found their way back into Marcus's quiet life in the weeks that followed. A community meeting was organized within the week, held in the modest gymnasium of the local elementary school, drawing a crowd far larger than anyone had anticipated. Police representatives stood before the room and openly admitted that their procedures had failed that morning, acknowledging gaps in training that had allowed bias to shape decisions meant to be based on evidence alone. They announced the introduction of a new training program, focused specifically on recognizing and correcting unconscious assumptions, a response they hoped would prevent similar incidents from happening to others in the future. Diane Carver stood near the back of the room for most of the meeting, gathering her courage before finally walking to the front to speak in front of everyone present. Her voice trembled as she apologized directly to Marcus, admitting that her fear had come from nothing more than appearance and assumption, and that she deeply regretted the pain her phone call had caused. Marcus rose from his seat, walked toward her, and accepted her apology with a simple nod, telling her quietly that he held no anger toward her, only a hope that she had learned something lasting from the experience. The room fell silent as Marcus turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice steady and unhurried, carrying the same calm authority that had once guided soldiers through impossible situations. He told them that what mattered most was not assigning blame to any single person, but understanding what the entire community could learn from a morning that never should have happened. He reminded them that judgment based on appearance was an old and familiar wound, one that had shaped his own life in ways most of the people in that room could never fully understand. Yet he also spoke of hope, explaining that real change did not come from punishment alone, but from people choosing again and again to see one another more clearly. Several people in the audience wiped away tears as he spoke, moved not by anger or spectacle, but by the quiet, unshakable grace of a man who had every reason to be bitter and chose instead to teach. By the time Marcus returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the gymnasium had shifted from suspicion to something closer to guilt. Officer Cruz approached Marcus after the meeting had ended, waiting patiently near the door until the crowd around him had thinned. She told him quietly that she had trusted her instincts that morning, but had not been confident enough to push back against a superior officer, and that she deeply regretted not doing more to stop what happened. Marcus studied her for a moment, recognizing in her hesitation the same uncertainty every young service member felt in their first real test of moral courage. He told her that noticing a wrong committed and lacking the standing to stop it was not the same as causing the wrong, and that what mattered now was what she chose to do with that discomfort going forward. He encouraged her to trust the instinct she had shown that day, explaining that it was rarer and more valuable than she likely realized. Cruz thanked him, visibly moved, and later that year she would be the one to help rewrite portions of the department's training manual, citing the events of that Saturday morning as the reason she had pushed so hard for the changes. Several weeks later, the military organized a small private ceremony, not to award Marcus any new medal, since he had made it clear he wanted no more decorations added to those he already possessed. Instead, the gathering was meant simply to honor a lifetime of service that had until recently remained almost entirely unknown to the community where he now lived. A modest group of former soldiers, officers, and a few close neighbors gathered in a quiet hall, listening as the four-star general, who had once knelt before Marcus on his own porch, rose to speak once more. He told the room that there were people who defended their country while wearing a uniform, and there were people who continued defending its honor long after they had taken that uniform off. He said that Marcus Johnson belonged unmistakably to the second category, a man who had spent his retirement guarding not a base or a battlefield, but the quiet, unspoken standard of what integrity should look like. The room applauded warmly, though Marcus, true to form, seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention, shifting in his seat as though he would rather be back home tending his garden. When the ceremony ended, Marcus stepped outside into the late afternoon light and walked slowly back toward his car, declining several offers for a ride, preferring instead a few quiet minutes alone with his thoughts. He drove home, along familiar roads, past the school where the community meeting had taken place, past the quiet houses of Maple Ridge Lane that had once looked at him with such suspicion. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed several neighbors already outside watering plants or walking dogs, and this time, instead of turning away or offering only stiff, uncertain nods, they stopped what they were doing and stood a little straighter. One by one, they raised their hands in simple, respectful greetings, acknowledgments that carried far more weight than words ever could have. Marcus lifted his hand in return, offering the same quiet smile he always had, unchanged by everything that had happened in the weeks before. He parked his truck, stepped out into the evening air, and walked toward the garage to retrieve his mower, because Saturday was Saturday, and the grass, as always, still needed cutting. In the months that followed, Marcus's life on Maple Ridge Lane settled into something quieter than the storm that had briefly swept through it, though it was not quite the same life he had known before. Diane Carver began stopping by occasionally with a plate of cookies or a cutting from her garden, small gestures that neither of them ever discussed directly, but that both understood as a slow, ongoing act of repair. The police department invited Marcus more than once to speak with new recruits about the morning that had changed department policy, and though he declined most such invitations, he agreed to a handful, always insisting the conversation stay small and unrecorded. He never once used those conversations to embarrass anyone by name, choosing instead to focus on the quieter lesson underneath, that a badge, like a uniform, carried responsibility that had to be earned again every single day it was worn. Walter Higgins became a regular presence at the house on weekends, and other old friends from Marcus's years of service found their way back into his life as word slowly spread among the community of veterans who had once served alongside him. What had begun as one of the worst mornings of his life became, in an unexpected way, a bridge back to people and parts of himself he had quietly set aside for years. By the time autumn arrived, the leaves along Maple Ridge Lane turning gold and settling across the lawns that Marcus and his neighbors tended each weekend. The story of that Saturday morning had largely faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer headlines and other people's troubles. But on that particular street, something had shifted permanently, something harder to measure than a headline yet more lasting in its effect. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to talk, sometimes about nothing more than the weather or the state of their gardens, small ordinary conversations that would have seemed impossible only months before. Marcus never brought up what had happened unless someone else raised it first, and even then he kept his answers brief, more interested in moving forward than in dwelling on what could not be undone. He understood better than most that real change rarely announced itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, in small gestures repeated over time, the same way trust had to be rebuilt one honest moment after another. And so he kept mowing his lawn each Saturday morning, kept waving to every neighbor whether they waved back or not, kept living the same disciplined, unassuming life he always had, trusting that the truth of who a person is eventually finds its way into the light, even when the world is slow to see it. He worked slowly across the lawn as the sun began to dip low over the rooftops of Maple Ridge Lane, the golden light catching the edges of the American flag folded neatly on the shelf inside his open garage. Diane Carver watched from her porch for a moment, no longer with suspicion, but with something closer to quiet respect, before turning back inside her own home, without another word needed between them. The street grew calm in the fading light, filled with the ordinary sounds of evening settling over an ordinary neighborhood, the hum of the mower slowly falling silent as Marcus finished his work. He stood for a moment in his own yard, looking out at the houses around him, at the people who now saw him differently than they had only weeks before. It was not applause he had ever wanted, and it was not applause he received now, only a quiet, steady acknowledgement that had taken far too long to arrive. As twilight settled fully over the street, the flag in his garage stirred gently in the evening breeze, a small and steady reminder that true honor asks for nothing, and yet in the end it always finds a way to be seen.